variable for that very interesting video on Stoicism in the modern world. And I can't say enough about how much I agree that there is a particular challenge that's posed to Stoicism in the modern world, but it also illustrates, I think, something very interesting about the history of Stoicism that perhaps we could talk or haggle about or have a little bit more of a discussion about regarding why it is that Stoicism hasn't perhaps come to as much relevance as it perhaps needs to be. I think that the first thing that I would want to say in response is that Stoicism got pushed out of view because I think psychologically many people couldn't handle the strength that Stoicism required because it made death itself not a problem. Death is something outside of control. Christianity largely became a dominant cult in the West, which is a cult of death denial, an immortality cult, and it displaced Stoicism. And not only did it displace it, but the preaching in the New Testament of the covenant of life immortal or life post mortem, some sort of judgment day and as a resurrection of the body and or an immortal soul, these belief systems were very antithetical to Stoicism. And in fact, I've said this in other videos, Kenneth Burke argues that Christianity introduced the notion of the immortal soul in some respect to prevent Roman slaves from killing themselves, because the Roman slaves were killing themselves and Stoics didn't have any problem with suicide. And because some were, the Christians, the early Christians, taught life eternal and they taught against suicide. Largely, and they taught them that if they would do that, they would have to be slaves forever in the afterlife as well, and they would have, sort of eternal torment for it. And so it was a practice that came about to end, again, the growing trend in Stoicism. But Stoicism itself took too much, I guess, psychological strength. It's caught in a problem of death denial. Now, that itself, I think, is the most interesting, because if you look at what you're talking about, I think the thing that you're suggesting is, to me, most interesting. It is in a book that I do have coming out at Purdue next year. It has to do with the issue of what Ernest Becker came to call the Causa-Sui project. Now, the Causa-Sui project is the self-cause project as it emerged in history. And it began historically with a kind of collectivist Causa-Sui, where people would band together against nature and natural forces, and they would, in their collectivist actions, seek survival against hardships and obstacles and struggles and food acquisition and all these other kind of stuff. Slowly that became more and more individuated, and it was largely through money and literacy that the individual Causa-Sui project came to fruition in Western culture. And Western culture increasingly became more and more of an individual who is technologically outfitted and equipped to handle all of life's struggles. And you can see it already. I mean, you sort of have this nomadic, wandering person with a backpack that has a multifunctional computer on him and a debit card and all kinds of other, single floating person technologies. The thing, though, I think about what I would push the issue is, until people, I think that the thing that we'd have to raise is, isn't it the case that there are still so many things that are outside of our control? The natural elements, the weather, the unpredictability of natural disasters and storms, the degree to which death itself still poses a considerable problem, disease, accepting all of the kinds of hardships. So even though I think you could say that Stoicism in the modern world is on the decline because we have so technologically conquered and subdued nature, I don't think that that's true. I think instead what you would want to say is that even though the individual Causa-Sui project is afoot, and right now there's immortality technologies and people are trying to conquer nature on all fronts, the resistance is limited, and there seem to be always things that will be beyond our control, and it's going to be things like death and suffering and hardship and disease and loss, all of the death of a loved one. Um, I think it's the problem of how does one deal with death. Do humans today have the courage, the wherewithal to see death as a gift? Can they see death as a necessary part of life, or is death a problem to be subdued by eventual technological conquest? This, to me, is the Neo-Stoic question for the modern age. If you want to ask, what is the role of Stoicism in the modern age? It's to ask, do we need a philosophical safeguard and a philosophy of tempering against immortality technologies? When immortality technologies do make it possible to get rid of all, and again, you'd have to have the whole thing doesn't make sense. I guess if you chase it down, the planet, all of the life practices that people have right now are basically not sustainable. The climate predicted, 30 years from now, it's not looking good, even if people make major changes. Death is not likely, going to be cured in the foreseeable future. Now, there may be significant, cloning and organ transplant, but I think death itself, you're going to maybe double life expectancy in the next 50 or so years, but you're not going to see indefinite, prolonged life. That itself is going to be a kind of limit that people are going to have to be humbled by. And so I think the question, again, if you want to ask what is the role of the Stoic in the modern world, it's to ask how much genuine courage can they have to need little and to practice the arts of releasing beautiful objects in the world, of giving to the world, of doing one's best to leave a little imprint while acting virtuously, having the model of an ideal person today. It has to be someone who is able to think about the ambiguous nature of their being and how quickly they flee from that ambiguity. We're an animal who floats in and out of seeing itself as, a person in a family, to a member of a race, to an organism on the planet. We're bobbling around in all these relations, and the ability to bobble around makes our sense of obligation and duty much more ambiguous than I think we realize, and we flee from that in what could be called an authoritative disambiguation. And then, as we do that, a guilt sets in. The need to expiate the guilt then becomes all kinds of, I guess, repressed source of violence and hardship that people bring on to the world, in addition to all of the natural hardships that seem to be part of nature and part of the natural conditions that are forever going to be outside of our control. So I guess I want to say I think it was a great video. I really appreciate the things that you said. I think you're right that there is a decline of Stoicism. There needs to be a resurgence of Stoicism, a Neo-Stoicism, a Stoicism that acknowledges that sometimes emotions can be a good thing if tempered. I think that's part of the deal. I think sort of the David K. Reynolds orientations toward emotions is a little more helpful, to acknowledge them, admit them, not necessarily false belief, as true belief, but not relevant to the question of action. And then from there, force the issue of what would a culture look like if people could robustly accept death as a gift and see all of life as a gift, see life as something that's temporarily on loan to us, and to continuously try to make the best of all of that, and despite the fact that much of it is outside of our control. Okay, thanks.